Hi, my name is George Chang, and this session is Getting to Know Sitecore Identity. So a little about me. I'm a Senior Solutions Architect at Proficient Digital. You can find me on Twitter at George Chang or on LinkedIn if you have any questions about this presentation or anything about Sitecore in general. So we'll begin by looking at how authentication is handled in Sitecore today. For this presentation specifically, we'll talk about authentication to the Sitecore admin portal, but these concepts can also apply if you're implementing public-facing authentication as well. So we'll begin with what we'll call the classic authentication scheme. This is the authentication scheme that Sitecore has had for many, many versions, including the current 9.2 version. The implementation of this is based off the ASP.NET membership provider and something that was introduced to ASP.NET 2.0 back in 2005. In this scheme, a user accesses the Sitecore portal, and if the user doesn't have an appropriate authentication cookie, they're redirected to a Sitecore login page. The user then logs in with their credentials, and the application validates the user against the values that are stored in a database. If that user is validated, then Sitecore issues a domain-specific cookie to that user's browser. The user is then permitted to access the Sitecore admin portal with the authentication cookie. So this classic form of authentication is a basic implementation of authentication. A user provides a username and password. That password is salted and hashed, and then that salted and hashed value is compared to the value that's already stored in a SQL Server database table. In the case of Sitecore, this is by default the core database. However, there is the option to be able to separate out the membership provider tables into a separate security database. One thing to note is that the default hashing algorithm is what's known as SHA-1, which is no longer considered secure by 2019 standards. Again, this membership provider was developed back in 2005, and in the past 15 years, hardware has gotten to the point where you're able to brute force this algorithm with off-the-shelf hardware. So if you must use the membership provider and use the database-backed user store, it's strongly recommended that you update the hashing algorithm being used that in the web.config file to be SHA-512, that it's a more secure hashing algorithm. Sitecore provides documentation on how to update that hash algorithm to be used to store passwords in your database. If you change your hash algorithm, you will need to reset all your passwords. So more recent versions of Sitecore has provided functionality to support federated authentication. In a federated authentication scheme, a user accesses the protected Sitecore admin portal and again is redirected to the login page. This user is then given an option to use a pre-configured identity provider that's already been trusted by the application. A federated authentication can support a number of multiple providers, including Okta, Shibboleth, Google Accounts, and Azure Active Directory. So once a user is redirected to the login page and they select an identity provider, for example, if Azure Active Directory is configured as a trusted provider, you'll be redirected to an azure.com address upon login. Once a user is logged in on Azure Active Directory, they'll be redirected back to the Sitecore admin portal with a token that's issued by the identity provider. Sitecore then recognizes that cookie as an authenticated user and issues a domain-specific cookie for your Sitecore admin portal. So federated authentication, this was something that was implemented in Sitecore 9.0, and it taps into the ASP.NET OWYN middleware to handle authentication. This allows applications to manage authentication separately using one or many identity providers. This is a common paradigm in the web today. You experience this each time that you go to a site and are provided the option to log in with Google or log in with Facebook. So once a user is logged in with this external identity provider, they can be mapped to a Sitecore user. So these Sitecore users can be persistent users that you have a version in your security database that you can map a login to, or they could be virtual users that are recreated each time. If you're using a virtual user, you can effectively manage Sitecore user permissions outside of Sitecore by assigning them to a group or some other property of a user that can relate back to a Sitecore user profile property. This, in identity speak, is called a claim, and you can map claims back to specific Sitecore roles to be able to provide adequate security to your Sitecore users. This allows you to have a single source of truth for your user management. That is, if a content author leaves your organization, they can be removed from your identity provider, and in turn, their access to the Sitecore content authoring portal will be removed as well. So now let's talk about Sitecore Identity and what Sitecore Identity actually is. So Sitecore Identity is a new role as part of the Sitecore Experience Manager that was introduced in Sitecore 9.1, and its sole responsibility is to manage identity and authentication for Sitecore services. With the classic Sitecore authentication, identity and login are managed by the content management role, as we saw earlier, and that's the entry point to the Sitecore backend. However, with the new Sitecore Identity role, authentication is managed in that role instead, and appropriate cookies are passed to the content management role for authentication. Sitecore Identity exists as a standalone .NET Core application. This means that Sitecore Identity can be deployed and scaled separately from the content management, content delivery, XConnect, and Sitecore roles. By separating the identity management role, it allows Sitecore Identity to act as a point of single sign-on for all Sitecore services that require authentication. By being based on .NET Core, this brings several benefits to Sitecore Identity over a traditional .NET Framework application. First, .NET Core is cross-platform and it's cross-architecture, which means .NET Core applications can run on Windows, can run on Mac OS, and can run on Linux. Also, .NET Core brings flexible deployment options. So you can easily deploy .NET Core applications into Azure App Services in the cloud, into containers, or on the metal, on servers, on premises, or in virtual machines. Additionally, .NET Core is very lightweight. You can bundle the runtime with your application so that there are no dependencies on anything else when you ship your application, as well as being open source. Sitecore Identity is also built on a platform called Identity Server 4. This is an open source identity framework for .NET Core. You can look at Identity Server as a type of authentication as a service, right? So it provides authentication implementations as a framework for you to use, for you to customize, and for you to build your authentication schemes around. Identity Server handles all the tough parts of authentication and is certified by many organizations and to be secure and to meet appropriate standards for identity management. Additionally, Identity Server is part of what's known as the .NET Foundation, which is a nonprofit organization that manages a number of .NET-based open source projects, which gives it governance and some legal backing. So let's take a look at the architecture of Sitecore Identity. First off, we can't talk about Sitecore Identity without talking about Sitecore Host. So Sitecore Host is a common platform for Sitecore services. Sitecore Identity was one of the first services to be built on the Sitecore Host framework. Other services such as Publishing Service and Universal Tracker are also built upon the Host framework. Sitecore Host applications are built on .NET Core, which brings all the benefits of .NET Core that we talked about earlier. And the Sitecore Host architecture brings standard implementations of a number of common features that you typically see in services and applications, such as logging, service registration, license management, and the like. Speaking of extension points, Sitecore Host also provides a plugin-based architecture. That means that you can extend a Sitecore Host application by creating a plugin and deploying it to an application. This is the means that you can add additional sub-providers to Sitecore Identity, which we'll get into more detail later. By using the plugin system, You can also enhance the service and application to add additional functionality to the Sitecore Identity platform that you need for your specific implementation. So let's go back to our classic authentication example from earlier, but now in this context of Sitecore Identity. So now when the user accesses the Sitecore interface and is required to log in, they're redirected to the Sitecore Identity service. The Sitecore Identity service will then authenticate the user against that same security database as before, and returning the appropriate cookies and claims back to the Sitecore application. Here, Sitecore Identity is actually using the federated authentication that we talked about under the covers. This Sitecore Identity service is a trusted identity provider for the Sitecore application. In our other example, we looked at federated authentication. In Sitecore Identity, this is what's known as a federation gateway. Considering our other example, the federated authentication, in Sitecore Identity, this can be managed with what's known as a federation gateway. This is very similar to the federated authentication scheme that we discussed earlier, but it's a level abstracted away so that Sitecore Identity will handle all the federated authentication from various identity providers. Identity Server calls these providers managed by Identity Server as subproviders. Each subprovider is implemented as a Sitecore host plugin and can be installed and loaded into a Sitecore Identity instance. This is important because as additional Sitecore services come into play, this allows Sitecore Identity to remain as the main point of authentication management. Additionally, you no longer have to perform deployments or make configuration changes in your content management service, so that might result in downtime in order to configure a new or add a new identity provider. Sitecore Identity will manage all of your subproviders for you without any additional configuration to your content management instance. So with identity subproviders, each of these is a Sitecore host plugin for Sitecore Identity. With Sitecore 9.1 and 9.2, Sitecore ships an Azure Active Directory plugin with the product itself that can easily be enabled and configured by modifying a few configuration files. Each Sitecore Identity subprovider plugin injects into the OWIN middleware pipeline to handle all the various different authentication schemes. The OWIN middleware here is code that executes before the executing application code. And more often than not, Microsoft, the identity provider you're using, or some open source framework will have created a .NET Core OWIN library for you to use. So implementing some of the most popular identity providers is easier than ever. Much like federated authentication, Sitecore Identity can support multiple subproviders simultaneously. So this makes it useful if you have multiple tenants on your Sitecore instance that are backed by different user stores, or you want to quickly integrate users that are external to your organization to be able to use your Sitecore instance. So let's take a quick look at a demo of what a Sitecore Identity plugin looks like for a subprovider. And so here is our demo Sitecore instance. You'll see this is a Sitecore Identity instance on Sitecore 9.2. You'll see that it looks very much like your normal Sitecore login screen. So in Visual Studio, I have a project here that is to create an identity provider for WS Federation, which is the protocol used for Active Directory Federation services to be used with on-premises Active Directory. So just as an example, we'll look at this first file, which is the configure Sitecore file. And so for each plugin, you'll need a configure Sitecore class, and this is the class that Sitecore Identity will look for in order to execute logic related to your Sitecore Identity plugin. So in the constructor, we'll see that we're injecting a couple of things. One is the iSitecore configuration interface, and one is the iLogger interface. In each of the iSitecore configuration interface is a service that's injected from Sitecore host back to how Sitecore host can provide service registrations. These are the services that it can provide you. iLogger is a standard Microsoft logging library that interface that you can use to log things to a log file. So we'll inject the services here as with dependency injection. And then also in the constructor, we're going to fetch the settings that are configured in a configuration file. So the configuration file is an XML file that looks something like this. You'll see that there's a number of nodes, but some of the XML nodes, these in particular, are the ones that you might need to fill, that you can set custom, that'll map to C# objects. So here for ADFS, we're configuring the ADFS Federation metadata URL and the actual Sitecore instance URL, which maps to a WT realm. Additionally, in your configuration file, you can map what's known as claims transformations and also other property assignments. So in our claims transformation here, we have an example that shows basically every time a claim that comes in from ADFS that matches a particular group ID, here is just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but typically you would have some kind of SID that you would put in here, the SID of a particular group, and I can map everyone in that group, all the users in that group, to the Sitecore author, Sitecore role, right? So whenever a user logs in through Sitecore Identity using ADFS, they would be assigned the Sitecore author role if they're part of this Active Directory group. So let's go back to our configure Sitecore class again. And like we were saying, in our constructor, we're retrieving the application settings and then we're binding it to an object here. Now, each configure Sitecore class requires a configure services class, and this is the main code execution for your Sitecore plugin that happens on initialization. So we'll take all those settings and it's assigned to an object, and then we'll see here that we configure the actual WS Federation OWN library. And so this new authentication builder is something that comes from Sitecore host that wraps the services. And from here, you can add OWN pipelines to your authentication builder. So this add WS Federation comes directly from a Microsoft provided NuGet package. That's the library to add WS Federation support for your applications. We add the appropriate options and metadata here and let the library take it from there. So once we have all this configured and the appropriate NuGet packages installed, we can pack this into a NuGet package of its own. So by using .NET Pack, we can pack that project, and now we have a NuGet package that's created for this particular plugin. Additionally, the NuGet packages for the Sitecore host build will create a sitecore.plugin.manifest file, and this contains all the manifest information for a Sitecore host plugin. Once that is done, we can install the Sitecore host plugin into our instance, and I have a little PowerShell script here to be able to do that. Otherwise, you would need to open up your NuGet package, extract the files that are in it, and place them in the appropriate folders. So let's take a look at what all gets installed when you create a Sitecore, when you install a Sitecore Identity plugin. Inside your Sitecore Identity server, you'll have a Sitecore runtime folder, and inside you'll have the environment that you're installing in, and this is somewhat of a mirror of the actual Sitecore host folder structure. We have the DLL file here that we just installed from the NuGet package that we created. And then we have a Sitecore folder here that contains the configurations and the plugins for the plugin manifest that was created in the NuGet package. So let's pull the configuration file that we had earlier. So this was the configuration file, the XML file that we had as part of our project. We'll need that as part of our plugin configuration as well. And this is where the configuration gets read in by the configure Sitecore constructor. So now that that's been deployed, we can restart our application pool for Sitecore Identity to load in the plugin. And if we come back to our Sitecore Identity page that we saw earlier, we can refresh it. And now we're provided with a button for WS Federation. This button will redirect you to a ADFS site to be able to log in with your ADFS credentials and to log into Sitecore. So the last thing I want to cover is there are a lot of resources related to everything that we just talked about earlier. So Sitecore documentation is a great place to start. There's excellent documentation about Sitecore Identity and Federated Authentication specifically. Also, more broader information about Sitecore host as part of the Sitecore documentation. I have some code samples out on my GitHub that you can use this link for, including the one we just looked at for a WS Federation. Additionally, there's some sample code for logging with Facebook or through a SAML2 protocol identity provider. That about wraps it up for Sitecore Identity. Hope that you got a lot of good information out of this session, and hope that you'll be able to use Sitecore Identity to its full extent in the projects that you're working on. Thank you.